Hello and welcome to Smith and Sheridan on Biotech, a podcast on the science and business of biotechnology, presented by me, Cormac Sheridan.
And me, Andy Smith. Hello, everyone. Hello, Cormac. How are you?
I'm good, Andy. How are you doing?
Good, thanks.
You want to talk about amyloidosis?
I did want to, but then when I looked more into, as an investor, you don't really get to grips with the patient. They're just people who take the medicines that the companies you're investing in develop. But looking in more detail of hereditary transthyretin amyloidosis, or should we call it ATTR, this amongst, or probably more than any other orphan disease we've talked about, it's a terrible disease. Okay, you don't get diagnosed until later, so it's a late onset. But then the multi-organ involvement, the cardiomyopathy, the neuropathy, gastrointestinal effects, and kidney failure, effectively, this is multi-system destruction by the deposition of amyloid from a hereditary or even a point mutation, a random mutation. And
just for completeness, in the protein transthyretin, which is a transport protein.
Yeah, which is a quite big protein. And some of the mutations are much more common than others. I think, is it the VAL? His 60 anyway.
There's a whole bunch of them, and there's different geographical prevalence. There's way over 100 pathogenic variants, actually, well over 100. Over 130 was reported by 2019. So it's a very genetically complex condition, therefore, as well, which means, therefore, that phenotypic or clinical presentation is also going to be highly varied.
But in any event, whether it's from an endemic area or whether it's from a point mutation outside an endemic area, by the time you're diagnosed, you have a handful of years to live. And by the time you're diagnosed, the disease has already progressed to its late stage, because if patients are diagnosed between 60 and 70, then they've had 60 or 70 years of amyloid buildup in their organs, which, with the best will in the world, with the best microbiological and pharmacological technologies, is virtually impossible to reverse. So what you're seeing is slowing the progression by the drug. And it did make me think, when reading about these patients, it made me think how grateful we are to have a biotech sector, because without that, you wouldn't have, outside of a liver transplantation, you wouldn't have any treatments for these. Going back to the typical age-old pharmaceutical profile of a drug, it used to be prescribed to millions of patients in primary care. And that was it. Orphan drugs were something that biotech only did. Well, we have Pfizer that has the lead drug, which is a blockbuster drug in Vyndaqel, or what's the generic name?
Tafadamis.
Yeah, which again seems to be the best drug, or the only approved drug out there. Or no, it's not the only approved drug, but the best drug you've got out there for these patients. But it has a mortality benefit. It has an effect on 6-minute walk distance, but it doesn't stop these patients progressing. So it just makes me glad, hopefully, that I don't have those mutations in the first place.
Can we say with any real degree of confidence that it is the best drug out there?
Well, in the clinical data today, that's one of the reasons why I wanted us to have a chat about this today, because another company which has 2 drugs potentially for this, Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, released clinical trial data last week on its second drug, but we can come to that in a second. So I'm sure you can tell me that Ionis, there are a whole range of new therapies, and even Pfizer's drug wasn't developed internally. It came from, I think, the acquisition of FoldRx. So This is not, okay, it is a small molecule, but it's a small molecule stabilizer. That's typically a protein stabilizer. That's not the sort of standard biotech drug, again, that inhibits one enzyme or something. So we are at the frontier of these drugs, and you can see, again, why it fits the profile of a typical drug that attracts biotech companies, because it's an orphan indication and it's a serious unmet need.
It is. And I do think that FoldRx, I think they came out of the Scripps Institution in California, and that they were pioneers definitely of this drug class. And it kind of reminds me mechanistically sort of your chaperone molecule.
Yeah, exactly.
In fibrosis. And if you can sort of in some way stabilize a complex protein structure, in this case transthyretin, it functions as a tetramer, but the pathology arises from misfolded monomers, and again, whatever mutation they have in their gene sequence arising with some sort of amino acid substitutions that interfere with the folding, and you get this deposition into these amyloid plaques. To me, I've always considered the disease like Alzheimer's for organ systems outside the brain. And
for every other organ system outside
yeah,
the brain.
and cardiomyopathy appears to be maybe the most important one. And yet it wasn't, the cardiac effects weren't uppermost in the minds of some of the drug developers early on. Alnylam was seen by many as the front runner and was going to eat Pfizer's lunch when it was coming through patisiran, just because of the theoretical mechanism that they were basically going to be knocking down production of misfolded transthyretin in the first place through the siRNA mechanism. It hasn't proven to be the case. And the Pfizer drug is now a multiple blockbuster. It did over $3 billion in sales last year. Alnylam is really struggling to make a case for itself that it too can have an effect in the cardiomyopathy manifestations of the disease. And they got struck down in their first attempt last year by the FDA. Their first generation drug, Onpattro or patisiran, they basically were told by the FDA that what they presented weren't clinically relevant.
Yeah, and it is amazing. And again, another shout out to the biotech sector that we have a number of therapies, whether it's gene silencing, whether it's protein stabilizer type chaperone technologies or antisense. And hopefully one day for these patients we'll have gene editing or gene therapy. But yeah, it's not your classical, going back 20 years, pharmaceutical, where you have a small molecule that inhibits an enzyme or a protein, or even perhaps a monoclonal that snags a protein or a receptor on a protein. These are cutting edge medicines that are today now approved to help these seriously ill patients. But the other thing that I've seen in my career as an investor is you can hear about the profile of a drug, how it addresses disease, and you can think as an investor, oh, that's eloquent. That's really that I really like that technology or the potential technology. And then it doesn't work as well as the eloquence of the technology suggests. And that's because biology just doesn't play ball with these sorts of things. So that's why you see.
Yeah. Or biology doesn't play ball is a very nice way of putting it. And the other way of putting it is that we put up these presumed mechanisms and these presumed understandings of disease biology that represent a partial but very complete picture of what's happening biologically speaking.
Yeah, and we've scratched the surface of ATTR in the introduction, but outside of the initial mutations and then the build-up of amyloid, you can't know what happens on the way to that and out in the periphery of that. So are lots of other disease processes that perhaps we don't even know yet, and that hopefully might be sources for other interventions.
I have a degree of frustration with all of this because there are clinical and scientific questions that need answering. There are patients that need better medications than they currently have. But the drug reimbursement regime that we're operating in actually militates against these questions being answered. And Alnylam, which when they were announcing their annual results recently, a lot of the conference call was given over to a discussion of their alterations to the statistical analysis plan.
I think all of the questions, there wasn't a single question. Here, this is our sales and our spend for the year and our hopes for the future. And then all the analysts ask questions about, so going back to the protocol, why did you change this, that, and the other?
Yeah, and just for listeners who haven't been all over the news, what we're discussing is the Healios B outcomes trial of their second generation siRNA drug, vutrisiran. God help me, I'm finding it harder and harder.
It's got a trade name, what's it called?
Amvuttra, which isn't any nicer.
Yeah, that's it. It's got too many T's or too many U's or something.
Yeah, they come in funny places. And basically, I did learn a euphemism listening into that call that what we used to call changing the goalposts is now called endpoint refinement.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an important take-home lesson to any other biotechnology company is that if you see something in the conduct of a clinical study, a knee-jerk reaction shouldn't be to go and change the trial protocol or anything like that. These things are set in stone and the statistical analysis plan is agreed with the FDA. Now, on that particular announcement, Alnylam said that they had discussed it with the FDA, didn't they? Or
Yeah,
they
they did,
they
yeah.
didn't say the FDA agreed with it. They didn't say the FDA said this is rubbish. You don't darken our door with this again. But they
Yeah,
said they had a dialogue with the FDA about it. And building on the trial results and the announcement of their first generation Onpattro,
yeah.
in the same indication that you talked about, I think finally, and it's been a long time coming, the ability to believe in what Alnylam reports on these studies is taking a bit of a knock. And I remember the first time round on the Onpattro phase 3 study, it's the Apollo B study. The results, when they were finally produced at a conference, it had a lower 6-minute walk test than Pfizer's drug, and it didn't have a mortality benefit that Pfizer's drug is. And the chief executive of Alnylam pronounced herself with those results, she couldn't be happier with those results. And it did make me wonder what would have happened if she and I had met when we were both younger. Because clearly she has a very low expectations and
Mhm.
is easily pleased. So who knows what might have happened. But then fast forward to the recent announcement where they've changed the endpoints amongst other things and a statistical analysis plan to move on from one group to another group or to split it between two groups. That's an absolute red flag in clinical trial conduct. You don't do that. And you only do that probably if you're forced to, if you've seen something in the blinded data that you don't like.
But they're blinded. They wouldn't have seen those data.
Well, and again, much social media commentary has been devoted to this. So you would think that there is a DSMB, Drug Safety and Advisory Board, so they can see unblinded data. But
Yeah.
if they're doing their job properly, any messages from that said either stop the study for overwhelming efficacy or a safety problem, or stop the study because it's futile, you're never going to show a difference between placebo and active arms. That's the job of a DSMB. Now, clinical trial people or clinical operations people on Ireland may actually see blinded data, so they can't tell whether the patient's one group or another group is on their drug or the placebo. But the interesting wrinkle with this is that about 40% of patients in the study are on Pfizer's drug as well.
Yes, that's
And
right.
then one of the things that came out of this primary endpoint change is to want to split the primary endpoint between only those patients on Alnylam's drug
Mm.
from those patients that could be on both drugs. And Alnylam sort of said, and as you've hinted at earlier, it's to do with the reimbursement. And I agree with this absolutely, that payers don't like to pay for two very expensive orphan drug treatments. That's fair. But in 4 years' time, Pfizer's drug is going to be generic. So combination therapy will be the standard of care. And if Alnylam's drugs get approved, it'll only have 2 years or so on the market before it's going to be combination therapy. But
Yep.
getting back to your point on blinded and non-blinded data, there might be something that was obvious, a difference in the primary endpoint between those patients who were on the combination and some patients who are on Alnylam's drug. And is the combination outperforming the monotherapy drug? Well, that typically shouldn't happen, right? Because we're after the same target, although you've just in your introduction talked about you can get different mechanisms of action hitting at different points in a cascade of disease, and that can result in synergy. So we don't know, or it could be that the placebo is performing better than the active drug from Alnylam if the
Yeah.
placebo includes patients, and it does, 40% of the patients who are on the Pfizer drug. So
Yeah, but see, I think though that the Alnylam management are aware of all the objections that you've made. They wouldn't have undertaken this lightly, because we all know that it is a bit of a no-no to, I don't know, change seats once the train has left the station. I don't
yeah,
know what the analogy is. So they're fully aware of shifting the goalposts and the accusations that that entails. And they are arguing that this will strengthen the statistical power of the trial. It will help for greater separation of the survival curves between the active and the placebo treatment arms, etc., etc., etc. We'll know pretty soon anyway, because they've said that they're going to be reporting data late June or early July. Some of the other work, they're just cleaning up some of the endpoints. But I mean, my big frustration with all of this, though, is that it's 2024,
mm-hmm.
and both of these drugs have been around since, in biotech terms, since kind of forever and kind of not. because actually the Pfizer drug tafadamis or Vyndaqel, it was approved in Europe in 2011, but it was only approved by the FDA in 2019. It has a string of CRLs, so it's not exactly a drug that has an entirely squeaky clean history either. But it's certainly proving itself in the marketplace right now. But
that's because there is nothing else, right, outside of a liver transplant
yeah,
perhaps one or two other drugs
yeah.
that, again, don't actually do much in terms of helping the patient's longer lifespan, but there isn't a lot else.
No, there's a few other drugs. I mean, basically, just for completeness, vutrisiran, that was approved in the polyneuropathy form of ATTR in 2020. There was a recent approval just late last year, Wainua, or eplontersen, an AstraZeneca drug originally.
Ionis,
yeah. So that was approved in ATTR-PN in 2023, December 2023. So they all have modest effects on disease measures such as the neuropathy impairment score +7. That's a kind of a composite of various clinical and neuropathic factors. They have modest effects, and say also there's the Norfolk quality of life disease questionnaire. They have modest effects, but the only people who've actually reported survival data are Pfizer. And again, it's not, as for reasons that you have outlined already, you can't expect too much given the deeply embedded nature of the disease process by the time it becomes apparent. But in their pivotal trial of tafadamis, at 30 months, 70.5% of patients on the drug were alive versus 57.1% of those on placebo. So there's clear separation, but it's not as if it's saving your life. It's prolonging life, it would appear.
And that's a strange dynamic in the history of drug development here, because sometimes you find that the first drug approved is the best drug. And everything else that comes after that is sort of trying to marshal the current state of drug discovery technology as a sledgehammer to crack a nut that's already been cracked. We've seen it recently with Vertex Pharmaceuticals and their pain drug, which did the job of preventing pain, but it's no better than cheap as chips opioid drugs without the dependency that opioid drugs have. And penicillin, right? I mean, for a sensitive organism, you still have the organism that causes syphilis is still what used to be described in the textbooks as exquisitely sensitive to penicillin. It still is today for sensitive strains. Why is it sometimes that the first drug is always the best drug? Well, it's because it was the most obvious one.
Yeah. At the same time, and getting back to me wanting to vent my frustration is that we have in the Healios B arm, which is an outcome study that aims to establish a survival benefit for patients who have the cardiomyopathy dimensions of amyloidosis, because the drug is already approved in the polyneuropathy form of it. So effectively what they have is a placebo arm, a Amvuttra monotherapy arm, and an Amvuttra tafadamis, or to use the brand name Vyndaqel or Vyndamax, or to use the Japanese brand Vynmax, just for completeness.
But I don't think it was originally designed as that, Cormac. It was originally designed as a placebo-controlled study, and then some patients on both arms could have Pfizer's drug.
Fully accept all that, but the point I'm making is that there's all this inferred head-to-head comparisons from unscientific reading across from different trials. Why can't we just have proper head-to-head studies to trash it out for once and for all? Because this is a case where, now I must say, Alnylam are very confident that they will get an outcome that will favour approval. And all they're saying is that, I mean, I'm going to quote Yvonne Greenstreet, the CEO, on the trial and the changes there too. The changes we're announcing today enhance an already robust study. So, I mean, she's setting herself up for a very serious investor class action lawsuit there.
Well, I mean, she was already there, though, Cormac. If you think of the Apollo B study, where the results of which, within the bounds of cross-study comparisons, their product Onpattro didn't have a survival benefit, and it had a lower 6-minute walk distance than Pfizer's drug. She said she couldn't be happier with that data. Now, I'm a bit harder to please than that. So investors see, but as you pointed out, the FDA gave them a complete response letter, so they weren't happy with it either.
Yeah, but. The Apollo B study was a 12-month study, and you're comparing it with a 30-month Pfizer study.
Yeah.
You're not comparing like with like at all.
But
And
a 30-month study in these patients who progress anyway,
yes,
it is a much higher bar, isn't it?
no, but that's the point. And I mean, basically, Alnylam have basically based Helios on the Apollo B study, but they recognized that it wasn't long enough or big enough, and that's why they've gone longer and larger. That basically Helios B is it twice as large and three times longer and two times bigger, basically, in terms of patient numbers. So, I mean, it's not scientific to compare the Pfizer 30-month study, 30, with the Apollo study, which is 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can make that inference. And what you can do is raise hypotheses which you can then seek to answer. Now, what I wish they had sought to do was just that they actually just went for broke and did a proper head-to-head comparison. And I would say that I'm not focusing exclusively at all on ATTR in all its manifestations. I would go across the board in all sorts of indications. Drug companies have been running away from head-to-head trials for decades.
And I agree with you, Cormac, but I would encourage you to take that up with the head of the FDA, whose gold standard is still today the placebo-controlled study. In Europe, we're much more pragmatic about it. Show me an active comparator and you can get... And in Japan, Japan, you can't get a premium price drug without showing it's better than the competition.
And I have no problem with a placebo arm, and I know there's a crossover at some point as well for ethical considerations. You can't have people on placebo and in cancer typically it's an additive, right? You have your existing standard of care, you layer on the investigational agent on top and give placebo as well. And that's fine. I have no problem with that either. But when you're testing monotherapy versus placebo, when there is existing standard of care, I just think that are you trying to hide something or are you trying to establish something?
And you've walked straight into that trap then, Cormac, because that's what, with Alnylam's revised analysis on their primary endpoint, they absolutely don't want to do. They only want a placebo-controlled study because they may or may not have seen something in the combination or the general population that has 40% on Pfizer's drug that they don't like.
But the one positive about this revision of the study endpoints and statistical analytical plan is that they are separating out the combination arm from the monotherapy arm. So 40% of the patients are on the combo and 60% of them are on Amvuttra only. So I presume you can therefore draw very interesting inferences, which I think is very valuable, rather than having what was previously the case. You just have the pooled result and you were kind of blinded to who was on what. So I think that is scientifically literate, and it's just surprising that it wasn't considered in the first place.
And we are of an accord on that one. When the trial comes out, we will be living in very interesting times.
Yeah, it might be time to go on holidays, though. It might be too interesting. And I mean, just looking further afield, I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see whether Astra and Ionis can move the needle at all with their drug. To me, I think it has a once monthly subcutaneous injection. I think you can do it at home, though, which is a bit of an advantage.
Yeah.
I mean, the Alnylam drugs, the Onpattro, which is the original of the species, was dosed every 3 weeks. But the new one, Amvuttra, that's dosed every 3 months, quarterly, which is...
I don't expect you'll get much sympathy from payers paying for that convenience because, as we talked about, these patients, late-stage patients, by the time they're diagnosed, they're already debilitated. They're going to be cared for in hospital or clinics or homes by carers who can quite easily... I mean, it says self-injected injection, right? The patients aren't up to do it themselves. So it'll be the...
Yeah, it's not... I mean, we're not talking diabetes here. Yeah.
No.
And I mean, just for completeness, I mean, there's a few other phase 3 programs underway.
And there needs to be, because, we have the cutting edge of biotechnology and drug development addressing this, but it's still not good enough. Those patients still progress. There's nothing that reverses that amyloid buildup. So we still do need more drugs.
So AstraZeneca inherited through its acquisition of Alexion, an antibody originally developed by the Swiss company Neurimmune, ALXN2220. It's an antibody that targets misfolded transthyretin. So it's kind of reminiscent of the antibodies, which have had obviously a fairly mixed...
Checkered history.
very checkered history in Alzheimer's. But it's interesting, though, that you don't have the same question marks about the blood-brain barrier here, because essentially amyloidosis affects the peripheral organs, not the central nervous system, so that you don't have all that business about whether or not you're getting passage across the BBB or whether you're in some way interfering with the amyloid kinetics and you can affect outcomes that way. So that'd be interesting to see when they report data. And then there's another company.
I mean, for the amyloid approach, ATTR,
Yeah.
ATTR is made for an antibody against the...
And Novo Nordisk, our friends, moved into this area too. They picked up the Prothena program, which essentially, and Prothena, don't forget, were one of the originators way back when they were called Athena Neurosciences.
Right, yeah.
They were behind some of the early anti-amyloid antibodies, natalizumab, if I remember correctly, actually. So there's a long, interesting history there. And then there's another tafadamis kind of wannabe. Eidos Therapeutics is in phase 3 with their drug. It's called acoramidis. I may be mispronouncing it. So there is a pipeline and there is data to come. And for now, Pfizer is commercially away on a hack. It's kind of making all the money. Whether or not it's actually properly addressing the condition, it's giving some patients obviously some degree of disease stabilization and survival improvement. That's a good thing.
And it will be generic come at the end of 2028.
That's going to be very interesting, because then there'll be a backbone therapy and that presumably anybody who has a response to it will be on it. And then if you layer on top, and that's when we maybe can start to hope to see progress in this condition. But as we were saying earlier, we think we understand these conditions. And I know you and I just scratch the surface when we talk about disease biology, and the excellent scientists at these companies who spend whole careers or chunks of them on these diseases, they do know their stuff. But at the same time, knowledge is always incomplete.
And that's why we have a biotech sector, right? We have a biotech sector to develop these drugs that we don't even know about, and even the academic researchers don't even know about yet.
Yeah, and we use the C word too often, cures. But if we can just improve the situation, alleviate symptoms, extend lifespans, and give people a better quality of life, all of that's good stuff.
Absolutely. Keep going, biotech.
Yeah, keep going. Until the next time, Andy. Thank you.
Cheers, Cormac. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.